Greetings, sword friends. As promised, here I present the second part of my review of the two Royal Armouries collection swords, complete with my experience of the sharpening and cutting. If you haven't watched the first part, please visit the link in the description below to view it, which has a much more detailed and nuanced expose of each aspect of the sword, including the unaltered state of the sword prior to sharpening, as they come with dull edges per British regulation for being sold at a museum gift shop. Sharpening will naturally mar the blades in some ways. But first, let's address some of the seemingly contentious points that arose during the discussion surrounding the first part of this review. In my attempt at remaining unbiased and pointing out all the noteworthy aspects of the swords in question, I may have misled the viewers to a slightly warped version of my overall impression of these two swords. If it wasn't abundantly clear enough, here is my general opinion on these two swords. Yeah, overwhelmingly positive. However, after a lengthy conversation with Matt Easton, the designer, and comparing measurements of the swords, my previous impression was affirmed that the specimens I've got are indeed lighter and likely livelier than the originals, with the Type 17 longsword significantly more so than the Wakefield Hanger. There were indeed a number of errors in my review regarding the measurements of the originals, and I'm obliged to apologize as well as make corrections. I used the data published by the museum, which can at times be unreliable as some of the measurements were taken by individual students and were not fact-checked. I also used the data on the product pages at Royal Armouries gift shop and museum replica, which is owned by Windlass Steelcraft. Matt informed me that the base thickness of the original Type 17 longsword is 7.4 millimeters, not the 8 millimeter published on the official product pages. So I'm happy and relieved that the 7.2 millimeter base thickness on my longsword is completely within the margin of error, and given the hand-forged nature, has only a negligible amount of difference to the original. And we agreed that it was probably thinner on the upper portion of the blade than the original, causing it to be much lighter. Now, the original sword, according to Matt's precise measurement, weighs 1,495 grams instead of the 1,535 grams on the museum webpage. If we count the weight of the grip, which probably adds 50 to 60 grams, I would say the longsword I've got is less than 200 grams lighter. While it would be an educated guess that this results in a sword that moves and stops easier, we agreed that I should report this to museum replica so Windlass can be made aware. A few days later, I received an email from Mr. Pradeep Windlass, the VP of Windlass Steelcraft, thanking me and informing me that they were working towards the improvement of these products to remain even more faithful to the originals and the sanctioned prototypes on future batches. I appreciate that, as acknowledgement is the first step towards progress. For me personally, I'm not so upset about the differences, although they are noticeable enough. Despite having less material on the blade, even near the foible, the longsword feels significant and stiff, perfectly capable of fulfilling its role of an armor-fighting sword. It definitely retains the spirit of being thick and substantial, as Chris Fields suggested, according to his observation. It does hamper the cutting potential, especially on the upper portion of the blade, being so thick and narrow, thus having a large angle of the edge bevels, which we will discuss later in the cutting portion of this review. Regarding the Wakefield Hanger, Matt let me know the grip weight of the prototype, and given the original weight, with some minor material loss accounted for, the sword I've got is likely 1 to 2 ounces lighter, so that's completely acceptable. If you time travel to the year 1460 and ask the original maker to make a replica of the sword, this is likely what you will end up getting. Again, according to Matt, the original base thickness is measured at 6.5 millimeters, so the 5.9 is indeed within the 10% tolerance, which was speculated by Chris Field when I showed him the detailed distal tapering and thickness of the sword. He further assured me that as a sword maker himself, that this is actually pretty good for handmade objects. Just to be clear, based on what I showed him, Chris was very positive about the Royal Armouries collection swords. He studied some of the originals, but didn't have sufficient time to take the most stringent measurements of every aspect, and he plans to return to Royal Armouries to study more about these originals in person in the future. We agreed that I should not use the data he has got as a guideline, so I only use the museum published data and the ones from the vendor to compare to my measurements of the sword. I reached a conclusion based on his description of the original traits. If the points were conveyed poorly, that's on me, and I apologize. The intention was never setting one maker against another. No harm done, hopefully. I have to stress that I like how Matt Easton insisted that Windlass must follow the parameters of the original hilt on the Wakefield Hanger. It's very short and compact, exactly like the original, which is great, as I'm not a particular fan of the practice of making replicas with modified parts to kowtow to the needs of modern audience. And I have to sing praises of the grip designs on this entire product line, as the originals have almost all had their organic grips rotten away, so this is where artistic license can shine while designing grips to be period correct and suit geometries of the hilt fittings, while simultaneously being ergonomic. The grip designs all have the right dimensions and are perfectly utilitarian, but each model has a unique cross-section and tapering strategy, look like many high-end swords. I particularly like the oblong cross-section on the Wakefield Hanger and its multiple risers. The dimension and tapering make it fit the shape of the fittings perfectly. So is the Type 17 longsword, which is great to have an octagonal cross-section on the grip to fit the 8 facets on the sandstopper pommel. My Albion Prince has a similar grip design and I love it. During the cutting, I could index the edge alignment well with the flats of the grip, but the 8 facets make the angle between every 2 facets obtuse, effectively more comfortable to hold on to. However, I still maintain my position that the leather wrapping technique must be improved, as the ledges created by the seam on top of the risers really shredded my hand during cutting whenever there was an impact. Wearing gloves indeed helps, but I have diminished control over the sword. If you look at the grips on high-end reproductions like Albion or Atrium swords, the seams simply cannot be felt by hand, as they are counter-wrapped and compressed carefully. If we try to be fair, not to compare to higher-end swords, but look at the $250 Royal Armouries Italian longsword, before Windlass took over the contract, that is. The seam is also finished in a similar manner and is perfectly comfortable. So is the seam on the $400 LK Chen Rebaudo. It's also possible that the leather used by Windlass is a bit too thick and rigid. You can see it frayed at certain spots, and they came that way, curiously, which might also explain why the not so perfect seams are so prominent and so hard on the hand. Now, finally, let's talk about sharpening and cutting. I'd like to give my shout out to sword friend Matthew Cross for the instructions of sharpening angles on these swords. He's a very competent sharpener himself. Visit his channel to see how awesome his cutting is with the swords he sharpened himself. The Wakefield Hanger is very easy to sharpen due to its hollow ground thin edge. Also, I didn't mention the steel used in the first part of my review is 1080. Rather simple high carbon steel with tried and true heat treat to grant it the proper spring temper. I have to give it to Windlass here, as they nailed it. With the proper thickness and distal taper this time around, their spring tempering just gives both swords the flexibility where you want it, but the rigidity to stabilize the blades when you swing them. The hardness is between 50 and 55 on the Rockwell hardness scale, which is appropriate for sword blades. It also doesn't make it too difficult to sharpen. It took me 20 minutes to bring the Wakefield Hanger from 0.2mm dull edge to a razor sharp one on both the true and false edge. Coupled with the excellent handling, you can see how smoothly it glides through targets. Even with the false edge, which has a much more obtuse angle compared to the true edge, due to how shallow the edge bevel is, cuts exceedingly well. I have the fortune to handle a good number of lightweight and lively single-edge one-handers before, from Angus Trim, from LK Chen, Lens Connect Emporium, that are competition-level cutters. This Wakefield Hanger is easily up there with the best among them, and is even more lightweight and has a decent reach actually, with a 27-inch blade and a pretty good hand protection with almost an enclosed D-guard, a side lug, and the upswelled quillon. It also thrusts very well, with a mostly straight blade and the tip aligned with the direction of your thrust. It's quite thin near the tip, but it should encounter no problem against soft targets. Very happy with this one, and I think anyone who has purchased it will have a lot of fun this fall, cutting up the pumpkins. And you can see how much of a cakewalk it was to cut up the 15-pound pumpkins. No resistance whatsoever. I did run into some problems with larger ones, 35-pound pumpkins that have been left to dry for several weeks. The cuts were clean, but I didn't cut them deep enough. Still, you can see the blade made it through 85%, and the rest just broke off when it fell from the stand. Maybe not as spectacular to watch, but if used in fighting, this kind of cutting power would be more than enough to stop anyone short of full plate wearing men-at-arms. If I was an archer or billman fighting in the Wars of the Roses, I'd be relieved to have this sword at my side should the need arise to assist the full plate armored men-at-arms in close quarter fighting. Unfortunately, I've had almost the opposite experience sharpening and cutting with a Type 17 longsword. And not to the fault of the design or the execution, considering the purpose of this specific type of longsword. On the upper portion, the blade is tapered to be quite narrow but still thick. So the edge angle exceeds 30 degrees on each side. Well, it doesn't exactly exceed 30 degrees per se, but in order to give it a proper apple seed geometry at the edge and remove steel from the factory dull edge, you have to go beyond 30 degrees. That is when I run into problems with my work sharp, as the angular guide doesn't support anything above 30 degrees, so I had to manually adjust and tilt the blade further. As it gets far away from the hilt and your hand due to the long blade, it becomes progressively harder to keep the angle consistent. Also, given how thick the blade is, the amount of steel that has to be removed to create an apple seed on the edge is exponentially more than the blade on the Wakefield Hanger. The cutting edge is also longer, even though I don't have to sharpen the ricasso on the longsword, but it's double-edged. I spent about 4 times as long as I did on the Wakefield Hanger, and still got nowhere near the same sharpness. Eventually, I just left it there, as I deem it a competent cutting edge with a nice apple seed geometry. You can see how much it marred the finish on the blade surfaces. This would take quite a while to buff out with the steel wool. By the way, the satin finish on both blades are nice. Better than the typical mirror or satin polish on Windlass' usual offerings, even though I still think the wavering lines and rippling on the surfaces can be mitigated if they spend a little bit more time polishing the blades. In terms of cutting, it does cut alright, given the long blade carries adequate tip speed, and the rigidity of the blade stabilizes the cut and transfers all the energy the blade carries onto the target instead of flexing around and absorbing some of the shock. Descending cuts work better than ascending cuts, but it's a rather unforgiving sword for cutting. Because the diamond cross-section on the cutting portion of the blade is thick, it's not gonna go well if the edge alignment is slightly off. I didn't even try any Meisterhall as I normally would with my other longswords, because it simply wouldn't do well on those light targets. I did make a shield hull on a chunk of pumpkin, and it made about a quarter way through of an entire pumpkin. Still an incapacitating wound, no doubt, but nowhere near the power of an Oberhull or even an Unterhull. I had some trouble cutting 30-pound pumpkins to begin with, as I hit with the foible of the blade, and it neither has the mass to carry through nor the flat and thin edge geometry to pass through with minimal resistance. To be fair, even a performance cutter like the Munitoshi katana had trouble carrying all the way through if I hit too close to the tip. When I commit myself fully and stand closer to hit with the lower portion of the blade, it can still cut well enough. You can see there's quite a few clean cuts through the entire pumpkin, even with the rising cuts. That's not exactly the hallmark of a good cutting sword. If you need a 210-pound dude to use 70 to 80% of his power, but then the Elshot Type 17 longswords are typically considered to be more about thrusting than cutting. It still has the ability to incapacitate unarmored opponents, just not very reliable against those clad in thick and rough gambesons. If you compare it to a concentric sword like the Type 19 Irish war sword, you can see how much of a difference it makes. The Type 19 sword's blade at the point of percussion is twice as wide, but only half as thin, with a flattened hexagonal cross-section. It cuts even 50-pound pumpkins with ease, but the rounded tip has trouble thrusting all the way through. Where the Type 17 longsword has the geometry to penetrate all the way through, and the ricasso makes it easy to grab onto in half-swording stances. Different purposes, I say, each fulfills appropriately. One thing I did take note of during handling and cutting is that the foible still carries considerable amount of mass. I'm not so sure how to elaborate the exact feeling, but if I throw a committed swing and forcibly stop it, the tip would take a split second to stabilize. Perhaps if the cut is interrupted by another blade in actual fighting, and the user tries to wind from the bind, it would be quite different. Maybe the mass of the foible can even give you an advantage during binding. I can't test this one out, of course, as I don't want to send anyone to the hospital or the morgue by sparring with a sharp and pointy sword, but it's an interesting trait for sure. Overall, a great start of a new product line. This is definitely the right direction that Windlass should take. Hopefully, they can correct some of the minor fit errors in subsequent batches and stick closer to the sanctioned prototypes. I'm excited about future models, maybe based on pieces from earlier medieval times or Renaissance Europe. Lots of opportunities, of course. Wish Matt Easton and Windlass more success in the future.